Well, hello, everybody. Jan Rutherford here with Self-Reliant Leadership. Welcome to our second LinkedIn Live, and this time a panel discussion with my good friend Tim Cole and my new friend Candace Frost. And today we're going to talk about this topic of trust. And before I get into the topic, I want to introduce both Tim and Candace. And Tim, if you could start off and introduce yourself, that would be fantastic.
Well, first, thank you, Jan. It's a pleasure to join you today. My story is fairly similar, I guess, in some ways to yours. I stumbled into life sciences 40 years ago in order to try and find a career. I went to work for a small Midwestern pharmaceutical company, about $79, $80 million per year in revenue, and no idea what I was stepping into in terms of the enormity of the challenge to follow. And in the years that followed, I found that the job evolved into a career, and the insights gained from that little company that ended up becoming one of the 4 or 5 largest in the world so impressed me because I couldn't believe the enormity of the journey that at some point I would write a book about the experiences. The book became The Compass Solution, A Guide to Winning Your Career, and it was the lessons learned of someone who, by all rights, never should have managed to make, in my case, a 38-year career, but I did. And that book that came out in 2017 became the foundation for the company that I started, the Compass Alliance. And that company is all focused on this notion of people and leadership and culture, which I think is the difference maker. And it's why I'm joining you here today, because about 1988, I met a young man by the name of Jan Rutherford who joined that same company.
Thanks, Tim. Again, honored that you're with us today. Thank you. And Candace, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I am Candace Frost, and also thank you so much for having me today. This is a real pleasure. I've 20 plus years in the military, in military intelligence, and have enjoyed a great profession with the United States Army. I serve as a colonel in the Pentagon right now, and I'm actually on leave today, taking a break with my family, but I wanted to join in this kind of critical conversation on trust. I will transition from the military into another job, and I've really looked at different leadership areas. I really enjoyed kind of being able to speak on certain topics on leadership and mentorship, and I've started my own small business, Colonel Candid. It will also have a podcast launching next month, but all the little things that I can do to kind of push the needle forward in national security and talking about kind of this growing leadership that we need to continue to pursue forward with Gen X and millennials in the area. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you for your service in many years. I think people appreciate those that serve, but I think oftentimes people forget the enormous sacrifices families make to support those that serve. So not only thank you, but thank your family for these many years of service. So
thank you very much, and yours as well.
Yeah, thanks. Well, again, we're going to talk about trust, and it's come up a lot, since all of us have started our careers. And I wanted to start out with a little quote. A favorite professor of mine, James Clausen at the Darden School, teaches MBA, wrote a great book that I've used in my classrooms as well. And he says, hey, there's 3 necessary elements for trust: competency, consistency, and caring for the well-being of the other. One cannot trust the incompetent, the inconsistent, and the uncaring. So pretty straightforward. We all know it's important. We know from Patrick Lencioni's work, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, that if you don't have a foundation of trust, you really can't build on anything from there. So I'm wondering about your experience, that what's taught you about the subject of trust and how it factors into leadership today. And Tim, let's go with you first.
Well, I think it's a compelling question, and it's made more compelling by, as Candace pointed out, the situation that we all find ourselves in right now. This is nobody prepares for a pandemic, and crisis and adversity usually brings out the best in leaders, or in some cases, the worst in leaders. I'm reminded of some work that the Gallup Group, which, as you know, has spent 88 plus decades looking at business and some of the social trends and seeking to understand what's taking place in society. And they've been around since the Great Depression, a couple of world wars, a number of different crises. And when they publish their work, they say, hey, look, there's really four things that we're all looking for from our leaders right now. And I think those things are timeless, but they begin with the exact topic we're discussing today, trust. And then it advances to compassion, not surprising, stability, and then ultimately hope. But I think the benchmark against which all those things eventually are going to unfold is exactly what we're talking about, trust. And I can tell you, when people ask me, what's your experience taught you? One of the things that it taught me is that before I can believe a leader, I have to believe in the leader. And in turn, I have to hope that they believe in me. And I think the bedrock for that is this notion of trust.
Yeah. Candice, your thoughts?
I think that's a great point Tim just made, especially in the time that we're in right now, where we almost feel rudderless and kind of need that compass. So much of trust is intertwined really with the ability to hold or let go of control. And so we see that with really young leaders, and that they want to try and insulate and control everything in their power. And actually, the best leaders, as they develop, learn to let go of the rope a little bit more and more as because they have to, because other people have to grip onto it. So by losing part of that control, they actually gain so much more in return. And I think that's a really key component to trust, that it's a hard lesson to learn. You've got to be able to both give and receive trust yourself.
Yeah. And I wonder how much, Candice, that's tied into decision making. Oftentimes, a lot of the executives I work with, and especially mid-level, feel like, decision making is bottlenecked. It's slow. People aren't empowered. And one of the things that I believe that creates trust is that you actually empower people and allow them to make decisions, which means they are going to make mistakes. And have you created an organization in which learning is valued? And that means, rather than punish someone for making a mistake, you figuratively put your arm around them and say, hey, what did we learn here? Again, you're in a big,
absolutely.
You're in a big, sort of a sterile institution. Is that something that, even can happen in the military? And what have you seen in other organizations you've worked with?
I've definitely seen lots of change in the military with respect to some organizations do it much better than others, just because of the setup of those organizations, but kind of understanding and pushing the idea of collaboration. We see it a lot in software tools like Slack and different, even Microsoft meetings. When we look at pre-pandemic and now, what a difference. So much of our entire national government has really moved on to different platforms and different systems, which are more open, actually. And so, of course, there's a cyber element to that. But the openness, though, it allows more people to collaborate in a greater sense. And that part of trust is something that we've seen grow and grow. And I think it's really important. More people can participate, and we know that more diverse groups produce much better decisions. But let me go back to the point you just made, Jan. You have to be able to fail. Ooh, that's a hard word to hear. But you don't learn unless you have an environment where it's, I want to say safe, but it's feasible. You're not, you really don't feel that harshness if you do fail.
Yeah. Tim, can people fail these days in corporations? Are they allowed to? Is there such thing as what Peter Senge said so many years ago? There's a learning organization. Does that exist?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it depends so much on the company and the culture. One of the things I learned, Jan, from people like you, we ended up over the years hiring a lot of military. And I'd always assumed that the military was command and control. What I found was that some of the best collaborators we ever brought on board had a military pedigree. And I think it's probably because, as Candice points out, they grew up in an environment where it was okay to test and fail, but fail quickly, learn from it, and move on. So the simple answer to your question is it depends so much on the organic culture, and the companies that will struggle the most with COVID are those companies that are command and control, where the decision making is housed with a central few, and you can't control the ramifications of a virus. You just can't. I was asked recently, which companies do you think are going to thrive post-COVID? And my answer is those companies that have done an after-action review of the past 3 months, looked at their company, their market, their competition, and their customers, and said, what can we learn from this and how can we apply it? The companies that will struggle are going to say, well, now the gates are open again, off we go. And they're going to try to perform in a future that no longer exists.
Yeah, and we got a question that came in from Nick Altman, a former student in Ireland of mine, and he's asking, how do you establish trust when your job is 100% remote? So what do you think, Candace?
My big one is communication. You cannot over communicate enough. If you, and that doesn't mean working 24/7, by the way. That's another danger of the environment that we're in right now. But if you're having conversations, Tim just made a great point. If you're having conversations about change and realizing that it's not go back to normal. I think in the phrase, the new normal has come out, that shouldn't even be a part of it. What are you looking forward to? What is our future environment going to look forward? And what is it going to look like? We've got to understand that this ability, I mean, talk about money saved. If you look at the amount saved by just not having to use transit, to use cars, infrastructure, people are smart and they're not going to want to pay for this much longer. So if they can get the same amount of work from home, they're going to figure out a way to do it. So how you stay in communication, it's not 50,000 Zoom meetings. It's figuring out different ways to communicate in different manners that connect with people. And this is a great example of one of them.
Right. And at the basis of that is really trust. Again, what Dan Pink said about what motivates people is they need a certain amount of autonomy. Well, we've got plenty of that. They need to understand, the common purpose. And they need the ability to develop mastery, to grow and develop. And again, I don't know any better way to help people grow and develop without letting them stumble and skin their knees a bit. And that's tough because ultimately their performance is an indicator of our performance. And the last thing we want to do is stumble in front of our bosses. And so part of it makes me wonder, is the environment set up that's expected? That, hey, the only way we're going to grow the organization is growing people. The only way we're going to grow people is stumbling a bit. And that expectation is not just, internally with the culture, but also with the board or stakeholders to put pressure on the executives. Tim, our good friend Rich is listening in, Rich Gorman, who you had a hand in his career and who you and I both admire. And he's asking, and kind of related to what I just said, is whose voice matters more in a time of chaos, the leader, the line leaders, or the executive leaders?
I think it's a good question, and I'll answer it in a couple of ways. First of all, I want to tag on to Candace's comment.
Okay.
You can create a culture where failure is okay if the leader and/or leader demonstrates vulnerability. You can't when the leader has set himself or herself up as being omnipotent. And that's probably the best way to create a culture that people are afraid to fail. So that's the first thing. In terms of Rich's question, I don't know if it's an either or. I think it's probably a both. I would like to say that so much of culture is dependent on senior leadership. But Jan, you and I come from an organization where the reality is you could go to different parts of the country and you'd see a very different culture. And usually it was because of one or two people that projected a culture that other people bought into. The greatest gift a leader ever gave me was their trust. Because when I felt like I was trusted, I was empowered to step out there. And if I made a mistake, it wasn't the end of the world. The old story of the guy on the ski slope who's out there the entire day, and he comes back with his instructor and he's jubilant because he hasn't fallen one time. And the instructor says, "I'm disappointed. I wanted you to fall because you're not testing the maximum of what you're capable of." And so the simple answer, I think, is it's a combination of both. But to your point, and Candace hit it dead on, if you're really serious about growing, you're going to have to look at organic growth. And the only way you have organic growth is by optimizing human capital. So
Yep.
a couple of senior leaders, a couple of leaders throughout the organization, I think can affect that dramatically.
Yeah, that's a great point. Again, you and I in January, when we were together in person, talked about the three big levers of strategy. Money, IP, intellectual property, and human capital.
Yeah.
Very few people have a widget that nobody else has. Very few people have unlimited cash. and everybody says the same thing. People are our most valuable asset. We're all about service. But recently we had the former CEO of Honeywell on our podcast, David Cote, and he took his organization from 20 billion to 120 billion. And we said, "What's the secret?" And he goes, "The secret's in the doing." He said, "We all read the same stuff. We all know what we're supposed to do. It's in the operation, the execution, and I think it's in the balance of, demanding performance, which is a combination of results and behaviors aligned with core values. Not one or the other, but both."
Yeah.
So one of the comments we've got here is from David Ortiz, a veteran, Army veteran, aviator. And he's now running for the Colorado State House, who I very rarely say anything about politics, but I will say this: I completely endorse David's candidacy. He's a great young person and the kind of people we want to see serving at even higher levels. He wrote, "Even if the environment doesn't seem to allow you to fail, doesn't true learning from failure come from the people that have that value personally? I find these are the most successful leaders in life, regardless of whether companies or an organization's cultures allow you to fail. You take risks and you learn from failure anyway." What do you think, Candace?
I think that falls in line quite well, actually, and it's a great point on the book that David Brooks wrote, The Road to Character. He actually wrote that book, I think, either in the middle of a divorce or he had just gotten divorced. And he kind of walks through the struggle of being strong by a sense of character and walking through different examples of people who have failed or internally had a problem with what they have said and what they did. Two different aspects. So that's that part about character and why it's so important. If you fail at something, but people see that at the bottom line, you've got good character, strong character, they're willing to follow you. And just a side note as well, I think it's great when veterans get into politics. There are in business, politics, all sorts of area, nonprofit, those who continue to serve in different areas. It's just really an inspiration to all of us still serving because we kind of see what's next. So yeah. Congrats.
Yeah, side note, we had Amy Mcgrath on our podcast recently. And you might know that her, she's, running for the Democratic Senate seat in Kentucky. And, it's all up in the air until June 30th. Too close to call. They're waiting to get the mail-in ballots. But that's a big one that she's running for. Candice, let me ask you this. When we were prepping to do this conversation, we talked a little bit about, when you're on a team and you've gotten burned and you still have to work with these people and you're like, well, I don't trust them. And, the team can't go forward and, or gosh, I feel like I've trusted too much. And your boss or somebody says, well, hey, you got to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Be the bigger man, be the bigger woman. We've got to fix this broken team. What counsel do you have in that sort of a coaching, leading scenario?
I think you have to walk into a scenario like that with a big slice of humble pie and a little bit of grace, because we are all human beings, and at some point we are all going to mess up. But what I've seen, unfortunately, because of the hierarchy I'm in, and especially at the federal government area, people just don't have those difficult conversations. And so to be able to kind of step up to the line and say, hey, your words and actions are not matching each other. There's an audio visual mismatch. We've had a break in something, and now we have to talk about this rather than, out of sight, out of mind, ignore it. That's one area that I think most people, small issues can get resolved quickly by just talking about them and facing up to them. Either the ownership of yourself, if you have made that mistake, or the other person, because if not, you're constantly going to feel either insecure or you're in a dangerous situation, and it causes a rift in a work environment that it's just really hard to patch up the longer, right? It's not like fine wine; it doesn't get better with age. Face it forward, and you'll be able to solve some of those solutions earlier. But yeah, we do have a very trusting environment, and sometimes we in the military, as we look in different angles and start to transition, it's a different world out there. And I think Tim could probably speak much more to that in the business environment when that happens there.
Tim, what say you?
When you get feedback from someone, a leader, who you neither respect or trust, there's a name for that. It's called an insult. When you get feedback from someone that you do respect and trust, it's a gift. I work with a lot of senior executives who say, well, I struggle when I have to devote attention to a problem. And what I had to learn the hard way, because I do like people and I do care about people, the decision, to Candace's point, to not address it is to do that person a disservice. And so what I tried to embrace when I work with senior leaders and really first line leaders is the notion that if you really have a trusting relationship, that conversation gets intimately easier. If you don't have a trusting relationship, it gets infinitely harder. And I think sometimes that's what distinguishes what great leaders do versus everyone else.
Yeah. Candace, you used a word that I've only heard women use when it comes to leadership. And I think it's one of the most beautiful words in the English language. And it was the word grace. I mean, how's that factor in to leadership and trust? And why, and I'm curious, why do you think men don't use that word as much?
Yeah, it may feel a little soft and mushy, but it is a way to kind of step back. I mean, obviously in the religious sense, a lot of people use that word, but I use that when I do a lot of mentoring of younger officers to talk to them, or younger people actually who are just starting their first or second leadership jobs. You have to give yourself the grace to say, I can't do it all the time. And so in any work environment, we all want to be omnipotent. Tim just said that, right? We all want to do everything. We want to be everything to everyone, and we just can't. We have to provide ourselves the ability to either step back or to take a deep breath and say, I'm a human too. I am not Wonder Woman or Superman. I can't do it all, but I can do this right here, right now. And especially, when you're having that difficult conversation, you can be there with that person in the moment. That's a little bit of mindfulness kind of talk there, but also just give yourself and the other person the grace to make mistakes. I think it's important.
Yeah. And Tim, we're the other word Candace used was humility. And one of the things that sometimes when we're talking about trust, we say, well, to build trust, you got to empower people and let them make decisions. The other thing we'll say is, hey, you've got to be vulnerable. What do you think about that word vulnerable, and how is that different than humility? And is that an okay thing for people to be vulnerable these days?
I think vulnerable is probably the next step beyond humility. And I'm thinking about Candace's comment about it's amazing how often you find yourself in a conversation and you talk about vulnerability or authenticity or trust, and you'll hear someone say, well, yeah, those are soft skills. Those are the soft skills. And you know what I found, Jan, after 4 decades and after the last 2.5 of running my own company, the only thing soft about terms like vulnerability and authenticity. The only thing soft about them are the gentle sounds of all the egotists and narcissists who failed as leaders as they hit the earth and recognize it was that gap that led to their demise. I personally think that humility and vulnerability are underappreciated, and where I've seen otherwise incredibly intelligent leaders fail is because, well, real estate, the three laws are location, location, location. What I found in terms of why sometimes great leaders fail: ego, ego, ego.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Candice,
I love
you're
that,
nodding
by the way. That was awesome.
Yeah, you're nodding your head. I'm wondering, you work in the Pentagon. I'm just guessing there's egos in the Pentagon. I'm just.
They have humble pie at every stop. No. So I have to say, yeah, yes, there are. But on the flip side, I do want to point out that I have met some of the most selfless people, both federal employees and higher ranking senior officers. I'm honestly stunned most of the time at how selfless they are. Years and years of service that they've given up. Their family members who've also had to endure, the hours that they work, and the fact that they recognize, and what I love most about great leaders is they recognize it's not the rank that they wear on their own shoulders that gets them ahead. It's what it can do to open doors for other people. And those type of leaders are just phenomenal. You talk about people who influence. I have seen that type of leadership in droves compared to some of the narcissistic ones that we just tagged on. They're still there. We put them in a box. No, just kidding.
Well, you mentioned senior leaders. One of the questions I wanted to ask both of you, again, we love to put people in boxes, red, yellow, green, blue, ENTJ, we love to put people in boxes. And one of those boxes these days are generational. And you mentioned senior leaders, and I'm wondering what you're seeing, the adaptable, the entrepreneurial leader, regardless of whether they're in the military or running a small enterprise. What are the entrepreneurial leaders doing differently that's going to position them for success with any generation that comes along? Tim, what do you think? Because I know your book really resonated with millennials.
Well, I started the book for millennials and it expanded to other ages. Here's what I've learned about, and I'm not sure if it speaks just to the entrepreneurial. I think today's generation of workers, the millennials and those younger, as opposed to the baby boomers, of which I include myself, are much more purpose-driven and much more mindful of things beyond simply compensation. I learned that there are three drivers, and though I don't disagree with Dan Pink that autonomy and mastery and purpose are important, I personally believe there are three drivers for all of us. We all look for a sense of identity, we all look for a sense of purpose, and we all look for a sense of direction. And those leaders that can tap into the need to find who you are, why you are here, and where you're going. That's actually, if you go to this, in fact, you can stop right there. That Trinity of Trust I built some time ago when I tried to codify why some people seem to elicit trust from others and they don't, and others don't. And I found that there's three fundamental elements. One is we all look for people of character. And by that, I mean, we look for people that we think are authentic, are credible, that are hopefully somewhat honest and warrant our time and attention. Character is critically important. And the other thing we look at is we look at their logic. Are they rational? Are they strategic? Do they have some degree of rigor in how they approach the world? Because that's a fundamental element of how we look at others around us. And then the last piece, emotion, that's the feelings. That's where we look at real trust, at loyalty. We look at how they make us feel. And those three things in combination for most of us is how we decide whether or not we're going to trust someone. Here's what's really interesting about my quote unquote Trinity of Trust. And I've given you a 30-second overview of something that we do full day workshops on. But here's what I learned after I had developed this and begun to talk about it. I would like to tell you that my work is original. It's really not. When I began to look and really seek to understand it, I realized there was a consultant that actually built this some time ago, and I've never seen him on a TED Talk. And frankly, I've never even read one of his books, and it's probably because he's been dead for 2,300 years. His name is Aristotle. And his 3 tenets of persuasion, ethos, logos, and pathos, is exactly the same thing that we look for today. The people that understand that, those are timeless principles. And I know you very much believe in some of the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, but I look at that and I realize we haven't changed as much as people want to believe in terms of how humans look at others. We simply get swarmed over by all the other stuff that swarms around us and fail to recognize that the people that we place our trust in, we look at those 3 things, the ethos, the logos, and the pathos. And of the 3, by the way, and I think this explains sometimes why we go in questionable direction, of the 3, I think the one that's most important is the one that speaks to the limbic brain. That's pathos, emotion. We still follow our emotions, our heart, most of the time. And as we judge others, that's a big part of our decision making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Candace, what do you think?
I think that's a great point. And I'm going to go a little bit backwards to the point where you talked about kind of the different intergenerational. And, I'm the Gen X now. I'm the middle generation of most meetings that I'm in, and trying to almost be the interpreter. I'm not very good at interpretive dance, but I can speak both boomer and millennial, and trying to make sure that conversations are clearly flowing through multi-generations. It is difficult because talking about the emotion, Tim, you just touched on, there are a lot of emotions tied up to different things, right? The emotions that we're seeing in the nation right now are very strong, and you've got to actually speak to those in a way that different generations understand, and also ways that will encourage them to not only just get tied down into the small details of things, but see the broader picture. And that's kind of how you're able to paint through being able to speak in different ways with different people.
Yeah. Hey, we've got another question came in from my good friend, Evan Williams. He's at Baker Hughes, former Marine. He's attended a Crucible expedition with us, a good human. He wants to know, what do you do when you need to form a relationship and trust with someone who does not respond to your vulnerability or humility?
I took a deep sigh there. Wow, I've had that happen actually. I was the only female for about 10 years and many different infantry units or units that supported the infantry. And I would honestly talk about, my vulnerabilities. One of them I couldn't hide at all. I was actually pregnant with my daughter. And one of my leaders compared that to having a broken arm. And he said, well, in time it will heal. And I thought, I'm actually growing an American inside my body right now. So it's a little different than a broken arm, but it was the difficulty in that conversation and kind of the leaders that I had and the broken trust that I displayed a significant amount of vulnerability being a first-time mom, and them kind of comparing it to something that was just, to me, jaw-droppingly not associated together. It was tough, but through time and multiple discussions with different other great mentors that I had, I was able to kind of get beyond that. And then, of course, like as the military does, they moved me somewhere else. So I learned a lot of lessons from that, displaying vulnerability and not having it reciprocated at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's funny. I like your quote that you were growing an American. Yeah, that's good. Let me shift gears a little bit. Tim, you and I talked about this a little bit, that there's questions that followers quietly ask their leaders, or maybe they ask it only in their head, and how those answers they get, that feedback they get from those leaders, goes a long way with determining how those effective leaders actually differentiate themselves. What do you think those questions are?
Yeah. But can I get you to pull up the slide labeled Starlight Principle?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So here's my story. When I moved into management 1,000,000 years ago, I kind of took on a lifelong passion of trying to understand why some leaders seem to transcend and others simply seem to be there. And I spent time looking at contemporaries. I spent time looking inside my company. I looked outside the company. I looked at history. And I tried to draw some conclusions because there seemed to be very few truly transformative leaders. And so I began to form these questions that went a long way in helping me answer. And they were intuitive questions. The first one was, I would look at a leader and ask, are you credible? Because if they're not credible, if they don't have some sense of authenticity, competency, I'm probably not going to give them my time and attention. That was the easiest one. The second one was, can you help make me better? Because we're not going to follow or trust someone that can improve our station in life. Those two I used for a long time. And if you look at that Starlight Principle, you'll see at the beginning, at the center, I should say, destination, that's the what. Direction, that lower left-hand side, that's where most managers live. What do we need to accomplish and how are we going to get there? Mm-hmm. Direction, how, destination is what. That's where most managers live. But as I continued to study leaders, I came up with a third question. That third question was, are you committed to a purpose or a vision that I can buy into? And not a lot of leaders really speak to purpose. They don't speak to why. They just simply say, Tim, are you producing the results, and why not? When I got there, I began to really appreciate that leaders, they travel in a different orbit. But it was only when I came up with the last two questions that I actually identified what I think is the North Star for a lot of leaders. Those last two questions, do you care about me? And not surprisingly, can I trust you? Mm-hmm. The people that can give me a sense of their identity, help me understand my identity, and it makes it infinitely easier for me to follow them. So when I talk to groups and when I talk to senior leaders, I say to them, hey, look, you'll get compliance with the how. You have some degree of commitment with the why, but if you really want people to follow you, you better double down on the who. Because people will embrace a cause, but they will only follow a cause that has a face. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, FDR, whoever it might be, Gandhi, all have a face, and it's a face that people go, I will follow that person. And that's the difference maker in my mind for a lot of transformative leaders.
Yeah. For those of you listening that don't know me very well or don't know Tim, you might not know that Tim was my boss, 1,000,000 years ago. And one of the funny stories I love to tell is at one point, Tim asked me, hey, Jan, your performance of your team is really good. Let me ask you something. Are they committed or compliant? And I went, huh. And then he said something like, could you take vacation? And they would still do what they're supposed to be doing. And I'm like, no, I don't think I could. And then he asked something like, if you're on an island with these people stranded, would you be their leader? And I remember my answer was, no, Tim, I think I would be eaten. And the whole moral of the story was that I was producing results, but I didn't have the commitment of people. I had compliance, and because I was driving toward results, I wasn't winning not only, their head and their hand, but I wasn't winning their heart.
Yeah.
And Tim really helped me. And Tim did that as a leader by asking me questions. He didn't tell me I was being a knucklehead, which I was. He just asked me to ask these really reflective Socratic questions. And anyway, it was a game changer for me. And I've been trying to figure that out ever since then, Tim. And one day I'll get there.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. So we have a couple other questions. Evan says, thank you. You're welcome, sir. Rosa Dominguez, I agree with the ego problem and the need to achieve great results, building trust with employees and customers based on communication, humility, and honesty. However, I find a tendency to a lack of honesty from executive leaders with private agendas. Do you think that strategies and business goals can be used as an excuse for the lack of honesty? Candace, what do you? That's a great
So I
question.
jokingly say, you know how much money I make? You can look it up. You want to talk true transparency and radical change, the radical candor that I think Scott talks about. Start to publish how much people make. Start to ask the really hard questions. And I know that may be a bridge too far for some people with respect to full transparency. But when you start to scratch the surface and you start to figure out what's behind the agenda, whether it's, making sure that one of the executives gets a new watch or a new Beamer, it does make you kind of question what's your purpose to further their goals or for the company as a whole. I know those words seem a little kind of outlandish and radical, but you have to ask really hard questions. And if you can sense and smell something that's just not right, that will immediately start to kind of flow down faster than you can expect, like water, kind of down throughout the reins. And it's sad that that person's in that type of environment because obviously they're sensing that already.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I would say too, as a coach with people is, well, let's get a perspective there. Why do you think they're asking for these? Why are they driving? I had a conversation this morning where somebody said, I think we should be focused here. And, what I'm hearing over here is more of a focus on filling the pipeline. And we and there was a little disagreement. And then we talked about, well, why might that be? Let's really try to understand it. Let's get a perspective. Because one of the things that only the CEO can do is balance the short-term investment or the short-term yield with the long-term investment. Only the CEO can do that. Most of us are inwardly focused and focused from a short-term perspective. So I think that's a tough one. And again, part of that is the responsibility of the leader to be transparent in why you're doing it and who's doing it and some of the things that Tim talked about.
Hey, Jan, can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
Who was the person that asked that question, by the way?
The one I read was Rosa Dominguez.
Rosa should get the silver ticket because I think she asked a question at the heart of a lot of companies and a lot of cultures. I've said this for 30 years. Those who cannot lead at best hope to manage. Those who cannot manage at best hope to control. And those who cannot control at best hope to coerce. You're describing an individual who probably has a profound impact on the culture, who treats information like it's something that was handed down by the CIA. More often than not, it's because they're not comfortable with relinquishing control, and information is control. The challenge in that environment is to try and change it as best you can from your position. But the tough part with that is that you're influencing culture. And you said it well earlier, Jan. You can take company A, take all their products, all their resources, all those tangible things and everything else, transfer them to company B, and you have the same company. The one thing that is a non-transferable asset is culture. That is the one thing that you can't take from company A and shift over to company B. And for those executives who believe they're building trust by cloistering information, they're not doing it. You know, and I know that the father of trust is truth and transparency, and the offspring of trust is commitment and loyalty. If you don't have that, then you're going to have a breakdown, and then you wonder, why aren't people filling out the darn engagement surveys? Well, it's because they don't want to tell you the truth, because you can't handle the truth, as the movie said.
Yeah, well stated. Well, we're coming towards sort of the end of our time together, and I really wanted to have you, if the best you could, sort of summarize a few of the insights that have mattered in your own personal journey. And again, so if anybody's sitting there, with pen and pad in hand, that they're jotting down a few things. Candace, let's start with you.
Sure. I think just to get back really on, the point of this discussion, and it really is, I love Albert Einstein's quote, "Whoever is careless in the truth with small matters cannot be trusted with the important matters." So it's the little things that matter each and every day. Tim and Jan, you both said it masterfully. When you know someone, you know them inside and out. You have not a transactional type of relationship, but a transformative measure that you either bring forward. Again, the person with the title isn't necessarily always the leader at the table as well. Mm-hmm. So those lower level, brand new people that have great new ideas, if they are in a trusting work environment where there's openness, they have conversations, and they can bring forth the ability to even bring forward new ideas for change, that's demonstrable to the environment they're in, and they're in a great culture. Those who, have to rubber stamp and 15 times go through different layers and iterations to even bring forward just small ideas, you're really not building the team, or you're not sustaining the ability for people to stay on that team. So again, because I'm from Iowa, I have to mention, if you build it, they will come. And I really believe that with respect to trust. If you are building an environment where you're open to ideas, you allow collaboration to occur, and you're leading that yourself, you're demonstrating that, you'll have a much better environment that you'll leave. Thanks.
Yeah. Your comments about the creating that environment really resonate with me. Tim, what do you think? How would you summarize your insights?
I think Candace said it well. The greatest of armies, and I'm hesitant to use this when I'm talking to two military people, but the greatest of armies, as you know, are not built on the strength of conscription. They're built on the strength of purpose. The only people that ignite that purpose are leaders. I mentioned the 5 questions that I used for so long, and I want to go back to an epiphany I had. I kept looking at them and saying, what is it they do that make me look at them so differently? It was finally when I realized it's what they did that made me think differently about me. That was the difference maker. And so much of that goes back to exactly what we've talked about. The greatest leaders are those you believe because you believe in them, and they in turn believe in you. And that, in my mind, especially now, in the wake of COVID, this is where leaders are going to emerge, and it's where the pretenders on the wayside.
Yeah. Well, my crack at it would be a couple of things, and it might be stating the obvious. When it comes to team trust, you have to trust that people are going to do what they say they're going to do, that they are reliable. Part of being self-reliant is being reliable to other people. I think the other part we talked a little bit about is a vulnerability, that you're willing to try things, to be bold, to be adventurous in places where you might have a setback, that you might risk saying something that makes you look weak. The third, I think, is empowering people with decisions and increased responsibility that they earn. And again, it doesn't mean blanket, hey, you not only get a voice, but you get a vote and everything. I'm not for that. I'm really for that increased responsibility is earned. And I think what an executive leader really needs to do is what, you both sort of hinted at, and Candace, you mentioned from an environment, is design the environment where these things happen. Again, we can play traffic cop and be emotionally exhausted by trying to control behaviors, or we can design an environment where these behaviors happen organically and from within, and the organization learns and adapts. And again, part of that is it's going to be chaos. What is it, Tim? Your quote? Cats playing with dogs. What's your?
That's not mine. It comes from Ghostbusters. Cats living with dogs, mass hysteria.
Yeah, there you go. So sometimes it can be that way, and as a leader, you're kind of in the middle of it. But what we want it to look like to the outside world is it looks like a fine-tuned machine. We don't want to let them see behind the curtain. So. Any other thoughts from the two of you? I've loved having this conversation, and hopefully it's been insightful to the folks that are listening live and the people that will listen to this recording later on. Tim, your thoughts, and then Candace, we'll let Candace have the last word.
Well, the comment earlier about, is it a senior leader or is it someone lower in the organization? Never underestimate the impact of one person who chooses to be a leader. You know, sometimes people assume that because you don't have people responsibility that you cannot lead. Actually, the exact opposite is true. If you depend on a title to become a leader, you're never going to be a leader. I tell a little story, and I'll leave you with this story. A guy by the name of Thomas Geisel, years ago, was walking on a New York City street. He was a would-be author who had failed miserably. He had sent in his manuscript. It was rejected. It was rejected. It was rejected. He accumulated 27 rejections and decided never going to be an author. And on that city street, on that particular day, he met an old friend who sat down with him, cup of coffee, listened to him, asked questions, came up with a possible solution, and Thomas Geisel took those steps, and lo and behold, the manuscript was accepted. You probably have never heard of Thomas Geisel, but most people have heard of Dr. Seuss, who became arguably the greatest children's author in history. And when he wrote a book years later called Horton Hears a Who, I've often thought it was because on that one street, on that one corner, one leader said to him, I think we can do it, Thomas. We just have to make some adjustments. The mantra of that book is a person, no matter how small. One leader changed the trajectory of his life. And I think the title, Horton Hears a Who, is important for leaders to consider, because I think the greatest leaders amongst us, they hear who too.
Mm-hmm. That's a great story. Candace?
That's phenomenal. Thanks, Tim. My kind of closing points here would be to encourage wherever you sit at the table to open a conversation with the person to your left and your right. And you know, we've talked about the pandemic, but there's a broader conversation going on in our entire country and actually our world right now. And those people that either work with you, work for you, or you work for, if you're starting to turn that handle and open the door and having difficult conversations right now, and you're very uncomfortable, you're doing the right thing. We are in a very uncomfortable period in our nation's history, but we're also have the ability to really walk through that door and have the conversation. So those are the things that I would love to leave this group with is just take that step forward, have honest and truthful conversations with people, and your entire culture will be much better because of it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Candace. And a little promotion here. Candace will be retiring soon, and part of Self-Reliant Leadership is all about helping great military veterans, our heroes, successfully transition to the business world. And I see great things happening for Candace, and she's going to be a great coach and a leadership developer. And I am sure Tim and I are going to have opportunities in the future to collaborate, which would be a great honor. So look, mark Candace down as somebody to watch. I promise you, she's going to continue to make a huge difference in the world. And my friend Tim's book, The Compass Solution, is out there. And in addition to this great book that he's written, he's got a few fiction books out there too to take a look at. Super proud of my friend Tim. And the other thing I'll leave with you, that we are on the LinkedIn platform. So those of you that have premium, you can get over on the LinkedIn Learning. And I've got 4 courses over there. And the one that seems to be doing pretty well these days is Managing in Difficult Times. So that's a good one. And the other one, Grit, How Teams Persevere to Accomplish Great Goals, is one we filmed with Evan Williams, who was listening in the Colorado mountains back last August. And it's definitely not a bunch of people in a studio with a green screen. It's out in the wilderness with a whole bunch of great military veterans that are transitioning to the business world. So with that, again, thanks to my guests, Tim Cole and Candace Frost. Really appreciate your insights today, and encourage people to look you up on LinkedIn and to reach out and engage with you. And again, in advance, we're a little over a week away or so. Happy Independence Day to everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you,
Thank
Jan.
you.